Okay, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much indeed, Steve, for that introduction and for setting this up, and indeed to the association for inviting me to give this talk this evening. And the subject matter, as you see on the first slide there, is Monkstadt House, Flora MacDonald and Charles Edward Stuart, the story behind the association's two new plaques on the Isle of Skye. And this is really an interesting little cameo tale from the margins of the 45 Rising, to be honest. But it does also have some interesting wider aspects to it, namely a sort of almost a strategic aspect about the clans MacDonald and MacLeod on Skye. And I think also points up to one of the what ifs of the Rising. And what I mean by that will hopefully become apparent as I make my way through the presentation. So first of all, Monkstadt House is a house on the Isle of Skye. And where exactly is it? So to orientate you, I put this map in, you can see here. And if you're not familiar with the Isle of Skye, this is a map of the top third of the island. And the large lump of land you can see on the right-hand side of the map is the Trotternish Peninsula, with a Trotternish ridge running up the middle of it. And as you see marked in the red marker there, Monkstadt House is on the western side of the island. It's marked as a luxury lodge because nowadays, as you'll see, it's luxury holiday accommodation. So it's about 4 miles north of the port and anchorage of Uig. And you see the ferry dotted line coming out there. If you've ever been out to the Western Isles from Skye, you will have sailed from and or to Uig. So 4 miles north of Uig, near to the village of Linnecrow. And if you lift your eyes right to the top of the Trotternish Peninsula, you'll see the word Duntulm mentioned there. And there's a castle there, which I'm going to talk about and show you pictures of. So just remember that, that's where it is. So that's the locus. You might also have a look at the left-hand side of the map there, and you can see the Waternish or the Vaternish Peninsula, and the tip of that peninsula will feature in the story as well. Okay, so you're orientated, that's where Monkstadt House is. So who lived there and why were they important? Bit of background here. The owner of the house was Sir Alexander MacDonald, 7th Baronet of Slate, 15th Chief of the Macdonalds of Slate, or as sometimes known, the Macdonalds of Skye, and his good lady wife, Lady Margaret MacDonald. These are the only two pictures I seem to be able to find of them, but despite the fact they're not in colour, it does give you an impression of who they were, what they looked like, and I suspect even that those are their own signatures on the bottom of those two cards. So that's them. How long they lived there? They'd lived at Monkstadt House by the time the events unfolded that I'm about to describe to you for about 4 or 5 years. And they'd come from here, Duntulm Castle, which was and still is, I suppose, the ancient seat of the Macdonalds of Skye. They had lived there since at least the 15th century, if not earlier than that. And it was a castle of some considerable size, and you see an artist's impression on the left-hand side there of what the castle would have looked like in its heyday. Quite a considerable structure atop an impressive mound, and situated there, no doubt, for ease of sea transport. Indeed, there are still marks on the rocks underneath there on the other side of the castle where Macdonald's galleys were dragged up. Quite interesting to see them, actually. And also of note is that James V visited Duntulm Castle in about 1540 during his celebrated sojourn to the islands to subjugate the clan chiefs, and he was entertained there. And he subsequently commented that he was well entertained. It was an impressive castle, and he had a good impression of it. So a place of some standing. But I think by the middle of the 18th century, when Sir Alexander MacDonald was in the castle, it was probably a bit broken down, shabby, drafty and cold. And like many wealthy men of the age, he was looking to move into something more modern and perhaps more comfortable. and they were no longer involved in inter-clan warfare, so the defensive element had kind of disappeared from the scene as well. So they moved to Monkstadt. And before I move on, you can see on the right-hand side of the picture there a photograph of how Duntulm Castle looks today, a shadow of its former self. That's a relatively recent photo. And even 15 years ago, I remember a lot more of the castle being upright, and it's really imploding in on itself now. So they'd come from there, and they came to this house, Monkstadt House, or I understand in Gaelic they talk about it on the island as Tai Vunkestadt, and was built in the mid-1730s by MacDonald. And you can see it was a fairly impressive house. I think this is probably one of the earliest photographs of it, obviously taken more than 100 years after it was built, but you can get an impression of the wow factor that this house probably had in the 1730s when it was built. It was a considerable dwelling of some modernity, and it is said that when it was built, it was the first house on the island to have a slate roof, so an impressive dwelling of its day. So they moved there when it was completed in about 1741, 4 years before the Rising that we all have an interest in, and 5 years before the events of the story I'm about to relate to you. But before I relate that story to you, I want to take you back a couple of years before 1741 to 1739 to tell you of a strange happening that took place on Skye, which is directly relevant to the story I'm about to tell you, because in 1739, MacLeod of MacLeod, almost certainly, and probably the MacDonald that we're talking about who lived at Monkstadt, entered into a nefarious arrangement whereby they employed one of MacLeod's tacksmen to, in effect, kidnap their clansfolk, or some of their clansfolk, from around different parts of the island where MacDonald and MacLeod held sway, in order to sell them into indentured servitude to the Americas. In effect, I think nowadays we would call this human trafficking. And perhaps one of the early indicators of what was to come with the Highland clearances, and perhaps indicative of a changing attitude of the clan chiefs towards their clansfolk. Previously, they had seen some responsibility for them in a paternal way, but as the 18th century progressed and into the 19th century, they saw them as a bit of a burden, and that there were too many of them, and they had to be cleared. But in this case, a number were kidnapped. And I think somebody was making money out of this, and in all likelihood MacLeod, and although there's some uncertainty about it, probably MacDonald as well, although his wife denied that, although he himself remained quiet about it. So what happened? Well, the people were taken onto a vessel, onto a ship, and I've been unable to find out what the name of the ship is, but I can tell you that the name for it in the folklore of Skye in Gaelic, and indeed the name of the incident itself, is known as Sayach nan Dunya, which literally translates as vessel of the people. So these people were taken onto this vessel, and the vessel set forth for the Americas to put them into that indentured servitude. But something happened on the way before they got very far. And there are two versions that I can find about what actually happened. One version is, as you see portrayed in front of you here, whereby the vessel was struck by a violent storm and foundered off the coast of the north part of Ireland on the Antrim coast. Many of the people were able to make it ashore before the vessel foundered. The other version of the story, and I'm not sure which one is true, is that the vessel put into the port of Drumagee in Ireland, possibly for provisions or to shelter from a storm, I'm not sure. But in any event, what we do know is that many of these people who had been kidnapped managed to escape from the ship in Ireland, and they got ashore. Not all of them, but quite a number of them got ashore in order to escape. and they laid themselves at the mercy of local people in Ireland who took them in, looked after them, and those people reported the matter to the authorities. Ireland, of course, being part of Britain at the time, the authorities in Ireland passed news of this happening to the authorities in London, to the Hanoverian government in London. And the government there, hearing that it was a matter related to people from the Isle of Skye and the possibility of who had been involved in instigating this incident, sent word of this up to a man in Scotland that we all know well, namely Duncan Forbes of Culloden, a personage that we're all familiar with in the wider context of the 1745 Rising, Lord President of the Court of Session and the senior law officer in Scotland, and very much the Hanoverian government's man in Scotland. Although on the face of it, he was the senior law officer, I think he had a wider political role as well. And in fact, probably in the name that we might spring to mind from more recent times that would be indicative of his role would be that perhaps of the Secretary of State for Scotland, we might say nowadays. He kind of had that role. So Forbes received this information, this intelligence about the strange happening and the people turning up in Ireland, and he decided that it would not be immediately investigated, but he smelt a rat. He seemed to know what was going on, and he chose to hold this information in reserve. He was an intelligent, careful operator, or in Scots, we might say that he cawed canny. He kept his powder dry, and he held this information as a possible bargaining or blackmailing tool to use against MacLeod and MacDonald of Skye, should these two Highland chiefs ever appear likely to join any future Jacobite rising. And he knew two things for certain. A, they were likely to join such a rising, and B, he also knew that such a rising was to come. And indeed, he was not wrong, because as we all well know now, in August of 1745, Charles Edward Stuart landed in Moidart with the 7 men, etc., 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 and the rising began. And you all know the opening stages of the rising via raising the standard in Glenfinnan, onwards and downwards through Perth, and then to Edinburgh and the Battle of Prestonpans, which the Jacobite army won, or Gladsmuir, as it was known at the time by the Jacobites. And the rising gathered momentum in a way that I know you're all familiar with. And news of this rapid advance was taken back up to the Highlands as a rallying call to encourage more clans to rise, come out and join the rising. And on Skye, MacDonald and indeed MacLeod both started to weigh up whether or not to join the rising. After all of the other Clandonald clans in Scotland did, Glengarry, Keppoch, Glencoe, Clanranald, etc. But as you'll see, MacDonald in the end didn't. He was conscious that his family had only recently recovered their estates in 1727 after they had been out with their clan in the 15. And the loss of their estates and no doubt wealth weighed heavily on their mind in weighing up whether to join the rising. But on the other hand, he and indeed his wife, and certainly many of his clan and many of his principal tacksmen and kinsmen, the Duine Uasal in Gaelic of the clan, they were Jacobite at heart. And they considered the benefits that would accrue to the Clandonald were a Jacobite monarchy and government to be restored. Many of them harked back to the times before the loss of the lordship of the Isles, and they saw this as an opportunity to for the Clandonald for its fortunes and its ascendancy to be restored. So it seems that he was considering joining all of this, and he called a meeting of his principal kinsmen and tacksmen, the Duine Uasal, at a place called Sconser on Skye, in order to start gathering the clan regiment in case they should decide to join the rising. Now, I don't know if you've ever been to Sconser on Skye. It's a place I know quite well. It's on the east coast of Skye, in an area which was owned by MacDonald. And indeed, to this day, there is a lodge house there, which was built by his successors, clan chiefs in the 19th century, although it is a hotel now. Anyway, Sconser in the 18th century was a place where it was a communications hub. It was where people came across to the island by boat from the mainland. Mail came onto the island through Sconser, and indeed left from the island through Sconser. So as it happens, whilst MacDonald was there with the great and the good of his clan gentry, deciding whether or not to join the rising, a letter arrived for him. And lo and behold, it was from Duncan Forbes of Culloden, and at a fairly crucial moment. So I don't think the letter survives, but I think we can be fairly certain that it warned him against joining the rising, and warning him that if he were to join the rising and it were to be unsuccessful, then once again, his clan lands would be forfeit to the crown, and that he would lose his homes, his wealth, his estates, etc., and that he should think carefully before he did it. And it's possible also that he might even have been been threatened by Forbes with retrospective prosecution in relation to those events in 1739, where allegedly he and most probably MacLeod were involved in selling many of their clansmen into slavery. So, as it says at the top of the slide there, in the wake of all this, he thought twice and he blinked first, despite the fact that many of his clan were very keen to come out and join Charles Edward's army further south and fight for him. He decided not to join the rising, and along with MacLeod and MacLeod, was more or less obliged beyond that to provide officers and men for a government militia in order to patrol Skye and other islands in favour of the government, at least outwardly. As we'll see, they put on a show of doing that outwardly anyway, but in reality, their heart wasn't in it, as we'll see. And for me, this is the sort of what if moment in all of this that I mentioned and alluded to earlier on, because lots of people sometimes say, well, all of the other Clan clans were out in the 45. Why weren't the Skye MacDonalds or indeed the MacLeods? Well, these are the reasons. And it sometimes occurs to me to wonder whether if both of those clans had joined the rising, first of all, militarily, that would have added somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 additional armed clansmen to the army of Charles Edward Stuart, and also perhaps on a political front, it might have encouraged other clans also to join the rising that ultimately didn't. So, who knows what might have happened? Might not have affected the ultimate end, but it certainly may well have affected the way that the rising unfolded. So, what happened, what might have happened had they carried on from Derby isn't the only what if in relation to this rising, in my opinion. Anyway, we'll move on. So, notwithstanding all of those what ifs, the rising of 1745-6 progressed, and I don't need to tell such a well-informed audience as yourselves how that panned out, and what happened via Derby and the Battle of Falkirk, etc., and of course effectively culminated on the 16th of April 1746 with the Battle of Culloden, about which you all know. So I'm now going to take you closer to the events at Monkstadt House, which took place on the 29th of June 1746. Picture the scene. It's now 10 weeks after the Battle of Culloden, and Charles Edward Stuart has been a fugitive in the Highlands and Islands for 10 weeks. And in his so-called flight through the heather, he'd been all over the place, as many of you will know. And on the 28th of June, the day before these events, he was in the outer Western Isles on Benbecula, and he was under the care and protection of the Macdonalds of Clanranald. He'd been there for some time, but they knew that government forces were encircling them, both military forces on the islands, and the Royal Navy was all pervasive in the waters with its significant strength. And they felt that the noose was tightening around Charles, and if they didn't get him off the islands back onto the mainland, probably via Skye, then he was going to be discovered and taken prisoner, captured, with all of the implications that would have brought. So, as many of you will know, a plan was hatched to get him off Benbecula in the company of Flora MacDonald, one of the great heroines of, well, probably the great heroine of the Clan Donald. So she was introduced to the prince on Becula, and she agrees to assist with his escape to Skye. Flora MacDonald was a lady of the gentry of the clan, and somebody of some considerable standing, well connected amongst the clan gentry, as she had familial connections with both the Macdonalds of Clanranald and the Macdonalds of Skye. So there's a depiction there of her meeting Charles, and she apparently readily agreed to help him. She wasn't necessarily a staunch or rabid Jacobite herself. She just seems to have been a well-meaning young woman of some standing who felt that the prince was in danger and she should help him. So the plan was hatched to take him across to Skye and thence on to the mainland. So they set out on an open boat from Rushval in Benbecula with 5 oarsmen. The boat apparently had a sail as well, and they set out for an overnight passage on the 28th of June from Benbecula to Skye. And there's quite a lot of songs and goodness knows what written about this, as I'm sure you'll know. Fabled tale of Charles sleeping in the bottom of the boat and Flora MacDonald watching over him lovingly. Well, actually, that didn't happen at all. What happened was Flora was asleep all night at the bottom of the boat, and Charles stood over her and sang songs, apparently, to keep everyone's spirits up, because by all accounts, they encountered some rough weather which blew up when they were in the middle of the Minch. And they had a really rough time, indeed, quite a dangerous time. It was a dangerous passage. But the boat managed to get across to Skye the next day, safe and sound, although they had a very unpleasant and sleepless night rowing and sailing their way across the Minch. And here's a little map here, just showing you where they came from. If you look at that red line there, starting in Benbecula in the outer islands, or the Long Island, as we often call it, you can see the progress of their passage over the Little Minch, and just coming ashore there on the tip of the Vaternish Point, underneath the M of Monkstadt, you can see there. And I mention that because having had a rough night, they wanted to go and touch shore in order to get some respite. So they put in there, even although it wasn't their ultimate destination. But on approach to the tip of the Waternish Point, in fact, unsurprisingly, there were government militia stationed at the point, and they fired on the boat with musketry. And so the party in the boat, Charles, Flora, the boatman, Neil McKechnie, and all had to go out to sea again out of musket shot without any respite, and carry on across the bay over to Trotternish, to Monkstadt House, or to land as close as they could to Monkstadt House, in order to try and make contact with Alexander MacDonald and his wife, Lady MacDonald. Now, as I said earlier on, Flora was well connected with the Macdonalds of Skye. She had lived for quite a part of her early life. She was about 25 or 26 at this stage. She'd lived part of her life in the Uist. She was born in South Uist, but had lived on Skye amongst kin, and was well acquainted with our two principal characters, Alexander and Lady Margaret. and she knew them well. Indeed, there's some evidence that Lady Margaret was very fond of Flora and saw her as one of her favourites. So she was trying to get to Monkstadt in order to get some shelter for the prince and the party, and in order to find a safe house, if you like, prior to moving further east. So they arrive at the shore, a mile or half a mile from Monkstadt House at about 2 p.m. on the 29th, at a place called Altahuen. Flora and Neil McKechan came ashore and went off carefully to see if the coast was clear at Monkstadt and to find the chief and his wife. To her horror, however, when they got to Monkstadt House, they found that there were militia in and around the house. There was a company of militia, probably 100 men strung up and down the coast there, centred on the house, and the officer commanding the company, one Lieutenant MacLeod of Balmainach, was in the house dining along with other people. So the coast was not clear. And so despite this, she was able to confer secretly with Lady Margaret and alert her to what was going on, and that their true king's son, Charles Edward Stuart, was nearby at the shore, and in need of support and refuge, and what were they going to do about it? Now, this immediately put Lady Margaret into a state of alarm and some anxiety, and put her on the horns of a dilemma, because, were Charles to be captured by the militia, then that would be a disaster in itself. Remember that she was an ardent Jacobite, and her husband was too, although for reasons I've explained, they really had to put on an outward show, go through the motions of supporting the government. So that would be a disaster. It would also be a disaster that he'd been captured whilst in the care of Clan Donald, whether it be the Clan Ranalds or the Macdonalds of Skye, that, eternal shame would fall upon them for having allowed the king's son to be captured and taken prisoner whilst under their protection and care. And thirdly, she was also no doubt alarmed because there would be repercussions for her and her husband, inasmuch as they would probably be arrested and charged with treason and concealing the king's enemies and offering succor to Charles when he had a price on his head, £30,000, as we know. And no doubt that would bring about civil criminal proceedings against them, meaning that they would lose their estates, forfeit to the crown perhaps, and their homes and their wealth, and the same result would accrue where they actually had joined the rising and it been unsuccessful. So she saw potential disaster looming. So just imagine what pressure she was under. And I should add here that she was under this pressure on her own because her husband was not at home at the time. Alexander himself had travelled off to the mainland in order to pay homage and doff his cap to Butcher Cumberland, who by this time with his army, as you may know, had proceeded down the Great Glen and was encamped at what we now know as Fort Augustus, named after him, in fact. So her husband was away, goodness knows where, halfway between here and Fort Augustus. So she was on her own. So what was to be done? Well, in the meantime, in order to keep Lieutenant MacLeod busy, Flora entered the dining room with and sat down with Lieutenant MacLeod and some of his officers. She sat at the table in the company of the officers and was, in fact, very closely questioned by a very suspicious Lieutenant MacLeod as to where she'd come from, how she'd arrived, and with whom, and whether she was bound. But being a sort of level-headed, calm, an intelligent young woman of some considerable presence, she answered these questions with impressive and convincing guile. And many years afterwards, and in the meantime, when I say afterwards, after that, of course, as you'll know, she she married Alan MacDonald of Kingsborough. They emigrated to the Americas and suffered many problems there and came back. And many years later, in the late 1770s, she was visited by Johnston and Boswell spoke of this to Flora, and she often laughed, apparently in good humour, with these gentlemen, thinking back to those times, having deceived them so well. So she did a good job in keeping the militia busy whilst Lady Margaret decided what was to be done. So what was to be done? Well, Lady Margaret was fortunate in that although her husband wasn't present, her husband's kinsman and indeed her factor, MacDonald of Kingsborough, happened to be at the house at the time on business, and she pulled him aside outside, apparently, whilst Flora was chatting up the officers, and conferred with him and asked for his support and help. He was seemingly a calm, intelligent, clear-thinking man, and he and Margaret devised a plan to keep Charles concealed at the shore, to provide him and the others with victuals after their strenuous night and sea passage. And indeed, Kingsborough himself went off to the shore to meet Charles and took some victuals from the kitchen with him, so that at least they would have something to eat, and greeted him and arranged to meet him later in the evening at a safe distance from the house, where away from the militia, so that he could then conduct him safely on foot the 10 miles southwards to his own home at Kingsborough, which is about 10 miles further south of Uig. And this plan worked, and Kingsborough fulfilled that. Interestingly, I'm about to tell you about the unveiling of these plaques, but interestingly, on the day of the unveiling, I learned something that I never knew before about this little jaunt 10 miles south to Kingsborough. Apparently, I'm told, a gentleman spoke to me in the margins of our event to unveil the plaques, and he told me that information passed down from generation to generation amongst Skye people tells a story of when Kingsborough and Charles and Neil McKechnie and a small party were just south of Uig on their way to Kingsborough. They were fording a little river that flows into the sea just at the bay there at Uig, just opposite where the entrance to the Fairy Glen is, if you know Skye. And when they got to that river, they were met by a party of militia, another party of militia. And in fact, there was another young officer, an ensign by the name of MacLeod also. And he stopped the party and questioned them as to who they were, where they were bound, because obviously they were all on the lookout for Charles. And they questioned them, but seemingly MacLeod seemed happy with the answers he was given, and they let them proceed, and they carried on down to Kingsborough. But subsequently, for the rest of his life, that young ensign in later life, the gentleman by the name of MacLeod, told his family and friends forever and a day that in fact he knew very well who was in that party. You know, he saw Bonnie Prince Charlie dressed as Betty Burke, disguised as Flora's maid, and he knew and worked out exactly who they were. But he wasn't going to be the one to arrest him, so let him go. And I think this clearly points up the fact that both clans on Skye, MacLeod and MacDonald, although they came out on the face of it and went through the motions of supporting the government, they were only playing at it. You know, they were very much Jacobites at heart. Many of them had wanted to join the prince, and this young gentleman knew that he was looking at Bonnie Prince Charlie, but let him go. And I never knew that before, and I learned that on that day. Very interesting. So Charles remains overnight at Kingsborough House. They get there late at night, apparently, after a 10-mile trek. They must have been exhausted after, you know, a long and sleepless night at sea, skulking on the shore, and then, trudging 10 miles south to Kingsborough, arriving late at night, somewhere near midnight. He must have been exhausted. And when they arrived, Kingsborough went upstairs to wake his wife, and his wife was asleep, and apparently he woke her up and said, "Look, I've got an important guest downstairs, and I think you ought to come down and meet him and help me host him." And she apparently said to him, "Oh, I'm far too tired. It's late. I'm asleep. Whoever it is, I'll meet him in the morning." Until she was told, actually, it is our king's son come, and he's downstairs in our house. And she leapt out of bed and went downstairs to greet Prince Charles and try and make him feel welcome. The servants in the house, however, were not initially let in on the secret. And they looked at Bonnie Prince Charlie, who, of course, was dressed as a woman as part of the disguise. Remember, he'd come over from Benbecula dressed as Betty Burke, and that was the ruse he was under, accompanying his mistress, Flora MacDonald. And so he looked rather ungainly in this female attire in a male body, and the servants were a bit unsettled by his appearance as to wondering who this was. And indeed, one of them was asked if she would wash her feet, and she apparently refused on the basis that she was a big, ugly woman. She didn't want anything to do with her, and indeed she was a servant herself, and so she didn't want to do it. But apparently Charles's feet were, and his legs were, eventually washed, and he went to bed. And apparently that night he slept the sleep of the dead. You can imagine how tired he was, and they couldn't wake him in the morning, but they eventually did. And it had been a successful diversion down to Kingsborough, and he was moved on to Portree, where he rejoined Flora MacDonald. Flora, of course, had come to Portree down the main road on a pony, and because they knew that the militia would be watching her, so she entered Portree independently, and they were rejoined on a clandestine fashion in an inn in Portree, which the inn is now within the footprint of the Royal Hotel, if you know Portree, where they parted in the end, and Charles was taken on another boat from a skerry at the entrance to Portree Harbour over to Rasay. And if you know the story, you'll know that sadly the Royal Navy had done its nasty work on Rasay and had pretty much destroyed, burnt, and knocked down every single building on Rasay, all the houses of any note, all the black houses. There was not a roof that had not been burnt down on Rasay, and the cattle had either been killed or driven off the island. So there was no way that Charles could stay there, and indeed he had to move straight away, pretty much further east over to the mainland, where he skulked for some time further, and eventually via Cluny's Cage on Ben Alder, and that's another story, by the way. The 1745 Association mounted an expedition to find Cluny's Cage, and we did, but as I say, story for another day. So what happened then to Monkstadt House, and why am I telling you all this? Well, subsequent to that, and Charles's escape to France, etc., 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 the year after this, Alexander MacDonald died, a fairly premature death actually, and in 1747, and his wife, Lady Margaret, blamed the Jacobites for the pressure that it had put on him, and she thought that it had brought an early demise to her husband. And she apparently found life in the remote northwest corner of Skye quite harsh, despite the fact they had a fine house of its day. And eventually she and her children moved elsewhere, I think down to Slate, the other part of Skye that were Clandonald lands. And the house was then passed on to a succession of MacDonald's kinsmen and tacksmen right into the middle and late part of the 19th century, remained in the wider clan gentry's ownership. And eventually it was abandoned in the 20th century. And as you'll see in this picture here, it became a complete ruin. And this is a picture taken in the 1970s, I think. But indeed, I'm aware that in later years, the upper parts of the house crumbled even further and the walls were down to, the height of a man's shoulder. So it became a ruin. Now, I myself owned a house in Skye for 15 years until earlier this year, actually. And unfortunately, it wasn't as grand as Monkstadt House. But I tell you that because I was often at Monkstadt with a keen interest in this history over the last 10, 15 years. And I knew this story well. I knew all about Bonnie Prince Charlie and Flora MacDonald and Macdonald living there, etc. And I always thought that it was a shame that there was nothing in that vicinity to tell the story of this little interesting cameo tale that took place in the margins of the aftermath of the Rising. I always thought it was a shame that there was nothing. People that visit that area had no idea, what had happened there, and the place looked so sad. But in the early 2000s, as you'll see here depicted in this rather grainy photograph, the house was built, and the house was bought by two brothers by the name of McQueen, who owned, and indeed still, one of them still owns, a building contracting business on the Isle of Skye, and they bought the house with a view to completely rebuilding it. And they started doing it, and I watched this happen, and I thought to myself, well, I wonder whether this is going to be completed, and whether we could ever get some information around that area to tell visitors what happened. Well, the project was paused for a number of years due to various difficulties, apparently. But eventually, James McQueen, one of the two brothers, returned to the project and completed it in recent years, and has completely rebuilt and transformed the property into the fine property and house that you see depicted before you here in some very recent photographs that have been taken of it. And as I mentioned earlier on, it's now become luxury holiday accommodation. It's a sort of luxury guest house come restaurant, replete with sort of 18th century style 4-poster beds, and sort of 4 to 5, if not 5-star luxury accommodation, and it's run as a business. And I watched this happen as well, and I thought, it would be great to get in touch with the owners to see whether we could get a plaque erected on behalf of the association. And eventually, I had an opportunity to do this because in 2019, myself and Lois McDonald of Glengarry, who is present with us this evening, the two of us planned and organised and conducted the Macdonalds Society's 3-4-day outing, which that year in 2019 was to Skye. And we visited Monkstadt, and here's a picture of the group on the outing, and that's actually in front of Duntulm Castle, seen from the inland view, and you can see, despite the grand artist's impression I showed you earlier on, what's left of it now, not a great deal, to be honest. Anyway, that's the group, and you'll also recognise that very prominent kilted gentleman in the front there, Malcolm White, a well-known member of our association, and along with other members there of the Macdonald Society. Anyway, I tell you this because following this visit to Duntulm, we went down to Monkstadt, and I had arranged this. I'd arranged it with James McQueen and his staff, and we had an absolutely splendid visit to Monkstadt House. It wasn't quite finished at the time, but despite the fact that it was still a little bit of a building site, it was almost finished. And James McQueen's staff looked after us royally. We had a super visit. We had a tour, and we also had a splendid morning coffee buffet spread, and we were very well hosted. And I was able to speak to them, the owners, at that time. And to my delight, I found out that they shared my interest in this history. they were very interested in all aspects of the history of the house, and were very keen to work with the 1745 Association in order to provide some sort of information at the house in order to tell visitors to the house and also to the locality about the interesting events which took place there, which I've related to you back in 1746. So, after various difficulties and the COVID-19 pandemic induced delay of almost 2 years, I'm delighted to say that eventually, earlier this year, 2 bronze plaques bearing the Macdonald crest, which I'll show you in a minute, were unveiled at a special event held on a fine, sunny and balmy day at Monkstadt House on the 23rd of September this year. And here's a picture of the assembled party at the unveiling event. Worth saying that the guests of honour were Godfrey MacDonald, 8th Baron MacDonald of Slate, High Chief of the Clandonald, and his wife, his good lady wife, Lady Clare MacDonald. And you can see Lord MacDonald and Lady Clare in the front row there, and they're the two. Lord MacDonald has a green kilt and jacket, and Lady Clare is also in green there with a red handbag. They were our guests of honour for the day. And the former, of course, Lord MacDonald, is a direct descendant of Sir Alexander MacDonald, the 15th chief who built the house, about who this story is about, and whose wife, Lady Margaret, went through such turmoil and was placed on the horns of a dilemma that day. Indeed, in recognition of the fact that it was Lady Margaret in 1746 who faced this problem, I had asked the current chief's wife, Lady Clare MacDonald, and you might recognise Lady Clare as the celebrity chef from the, from who has been a celebrity chef for many decades now. And I don't know about you, but I certainly have one of her cookery books in my kitchen. Quite a celebrity in her own right. I asked Lady Clare if she would unveil the plaque for that reason, because it had been her predecessor, Lady Margaret, who had the problem all those years ago, and to make a speech and unveil the plaque. This indeed was done. So, first of all, on that day, I set the scene, and there's a picture of yours truly on the left-hand side there giving a speech, a shortened version of the history that I've just related to you. So I opened the proceedings, and you can see the plaque behind me there, which is on the gable end of the house, because that is where the public will see it most, and that fits our aims and objectives in the association to raise awareness of the all aspects of the rising for members of the public, etc. So it is placed there at the gable end for viewing by passers-by, etc., holidaymakers. So I opened the proceedings, and then, as you'll see in the right-hand photograph, Lady Clare gave a speech before she unveiled the plaque, and she gave a most eloquent, articulate, and interesting speech, centering upon her great knowledge of her predecessor all those centuries ago, Lady Margaret, and she talked about her life, the difficulties in her life, when she was widowed, and all of the events that took their toll on her, surrounding the rising, etc., and gave an interesting speech. After which, the plaque was unveiled, and here you see, I suppose, the principal people of the day. So on the right there, on the left there, you'll see James McQueen with the red bow tie and his brother, owners of the house. And on the right there, you'll see Lady Clare MacDonald and Lord MacDonald. And then on the extreme right, there's the ugly mug of yours truly. And so the plaque was unveiled, and we had some good press coverage, and quite a lot of people were present at the event. And we were delighted and indeed honoured in particular to have Lord MacDonald and Lady Clare there to give the event some profile and gravitas. And the whole thing went off very well. We then came around to the front of the house, And on the right-hand side of this, right on the right-hand side of this picture, you'll see a smaller plaque on the wall, which was unveiled by Lord MacDonald himself, who also gave us a speech about his forebears and their ownership of Monkstadt House, and related a personal tale about him coming to the house when he was a boy and how pleased he was to come back and see it all these years later. And so he gave a very gracious and appropriate speech also. But that wasn't the only thing we did, because as you'll see at the top of the slide, Sonia's coat hook was presented to James McQueen. So what was that all about? Well, many of you will know our association member, Sonia Cameron Jack, who lives up in the Inverness area. And in the course of preparing for this event, it became known to Sonia that we were doing this. She couldn't attend herself, but she did volunteer information that 50 or 60 years ago, when the house was an absolute ruin, she visited the house whilst on holiday on the Isle of Skye, and she wandered amongst the ruins of the house, and she went into what was the hall, and she pulled from some rubble a wooden coat peg from Monkstadt House, which may even have been original from the 18th century. It certainly looks very odd. I've never seen anything like it, but she pulled this and she kept it all these years as a souvenir. But on finding out that the association was having this event at Monkstadt House and we were unveiling plaques, plural, and having an event, she graciously decided it would be a nice gesture to return the hook to the coat hook to Monkstadt House, and asked Lois MacDonald of Glengarry, pictured on the right here, to present it to him, which we did. And the hook was presented to him, along with a handwritten letter by Sonia explaining, the history of this and why she was returning it to the house. And James and his brother were delighted with this. They saw it as a very welcome gesture, and James immediately declared that he was going to restore the hook to the wall in the hall in the refurbished house, and that Sonia's letter would be framed and put on the wall next to the hook to tell that story. So it's probably, aside from some of the stonework, the only original internal fitting in the house that is still there. So thanks to our member Sonia for that. So here are the plaques themselves, and I should tell you that why you might be thinking, well, why did we erect two plaques? Well, we erected two plaques because my plan was always to put a large plaque on the gable end, and there it is on the left-hand side. The association paid a sum of money towards that plaque, but it was done as a joint venture project along with James McQueen, and he, in recognition of the fact that it's good publicity for his business and his interest in the history as well, he contributed towards the cost of this plaque. And indeed, they're not cheap, I can tell you. It's phosphor bronze, and cost quite a bit of money. But James also said to me, when planning all of this, he said, actually, I'd like a second plaque also to be placed at the front of the house next to the front door, so that my guests can read it when they enter the house. And he said, I'll pay for that if you organize it. So I did. So really, we've got two plaques for the price of less than one of them. And as you see, it says on both, erected by the 1745 Association in 2021. So it has on the top there the Clandonald coat of arms, and I'll just read it to you. Monkstadt House, on the 29th of June, 1746, the famous Flora MacDonald visited this house to seek shelter, having arrived by boat from Benbecula with Bonnie Prince Charlie during his flight as a fugitive after the Battle of Culloden. The house was owned by Sir Alexander MacDonald, 15th Chief of Slate. Although he had outwardly supported the Hanoverian government of King George II throughout the Rising, his wife, Lady Margaret, was an ardent Jacobite, and she gave what discreet support she could to the prince, who remained on the shore nearby for fear of detection by government militia who were at the house. Unable to be given shelter here, the prince was led south to Kingsborough House, disguised as Betty Burke, Flora MacDonald's Irish maid. erected by the association 2021. So there you have it. It was a great day on the 23rd of September. We had a very pleasant event, and I'm pleased to say that not one but two plaques were unveiled, and at long last, the complete dearth of information at Monkstadt House telling the interesting tale of this cameo event in the margins of the aftermath of the rising has at last been told, and visitors to the area are able to read this and see what happened. And I think this is very much in furtherance of the aims and objectives of the 1745 Association to raise awareness of all aspects of the rising of 1745-46. So, ladies and gentlemen, that completes my presentation this evening. I hope you've enjoyed that, and I'd be delighted to feature, to answer any questions that you might have. And whilst you're thinking about that, I should also mention that we had a piper present at the day who piped wonderfully for us, a young man by the name of Declan Malloy, and he certainly added value to the proceedings that day. And not only that, but a local woman sang beautifully in Gaelic to the assembled company, a song in Gaelic which had been handed down in that area about Lady Margaret and her predicament that day in relation to Bonnie Prince Charlie. So there you have it. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you've enjoyed that. If there are any questions or comments, I'd be delighted to try and answer them or listen to any comments you have. Over to yourselves. Thank you very much.